In September 1987, a trust bought 109 hectares of ruined hill country farmland on New Zealand's Banks Peninsula and put a botanist named Hugh Wilson in charge of it. Gorse, a spiny, yellow-thorned weed, had swallowed most of it. The law had been clear for 87 years. It had to be destroyed. Wilson looked at that same land everyone else saw as a problem and made a different call. He decided not to touch it. Let the gorse do what it wanted. One neighboring farmer wrote to the local paper. "Heaven help us from fools and dreamers," he warned. He said Wilson's land would ruin the farms next to it and bankrupt the people who worked them. Wilson stood his ground. 39 years later, that hillside is part of 1,700 hectares of native forest. Waterfalls run through valleys that used to dry out every summer. The reason comes down to the one thing Wilson never did there. He never planted a single tree. Before it was farmland, this was forest. By 1900, decades of clearing had already wiped out all but 1% of Banks Peninsula's original bush. The trust behind the purchase belonged to a Christchurch businessman named Maurice White. Since 1977, he and a colleague named Colin Averill had been building a fund to buy conservation land on the peninsula. Neither man was a botanist. What they needed was someone who actually knew the land. That's where Wilson came in. He'd already spent 5 years surveying Banks Peninsula's plants for the Department of Conservation, and he was still in the middle of that survey when White asked him a simple question. Had he found anywhere worth buying? Wilson had an answer. On his recommendation, the trust bought the 109 hectares that became Hinewai. Gorse had already taken over more than half of it. 53% of the property sat buried under gorse and broom, thorny plants that spread fast and choke out everything around them. The previous farmer hadn't ignored the problem. He'd fought it hard. He burned it first. Then he sprayed it. When that didn't work, he brought in machinery and bulldozed entire hillsides. He even slashed it back by hand. According to neighbors who watched it happen, every method only made it grow back thicker. But during his survey, Wilson pushed past the thorns and found something the farmers had missed. Underneath the gorse, native seedlings were already growing in its shade. Maho, fuchsia, wineberry, lemonwood, five-finger. None of them looked like much yet. Give the fuchsia a few decades, it can grow past 12 meters tall. Its trunk grows thick enough to wrap both arms around. Its bark peels back in curls of orange and red. Someday these seedlings would tower over the very plant now sheltering them. A plant considered worthless everywhere else on the peninsula was raising the very forest it stood accused of destroying. As a botanist, Wilson knew something the farmers around him didn't. Gorse is a legume, part of the same family as clover and beans. It pulls nitrogen from the air and feeds it into the soil through its roots. On land stripped bare by a century of grazing, that made it the first thing capable of fertilizing the ground back to life. Its thorns did something just as useful. Sheep and cattle will eat gorse when it's young and soft. Once the thorns harden, they leave it alone completely. Every other plant on the property got grazed down to nothing. A seedling growing inside a gorse thicket was safe. So instead of fighting the gorse, Wilson and the trust did something almost nobody expected. They removed the goats, sheep, cattle, and possums that had been keeping the land bare. Then they left the gorse alone. Wilson's plan let it keep doing its job. Eventually, the trees growing underneath it would get tall enough to block the sunlight gorse depends on. That alone would kill it. Wilson published the idea in a peer-reviewed paper. The peninsula wasn't persuaded. He'd written his own explanation in the local paper first, laying out the plan before anyone had complained. A farmer's reply came within the fortnight. Gorse turning into forest wasn't worth anything, he said. Pine trees would have at least paid for themselves. The neighbors could see it happening from their own fields. Every season, more of Hinewai's hillside turned yellow with gorse. One of the children who saw it was 10 years old at the time. Her family had farmed the valley next door for 7 generations. She remembers almost nothing else about that day, just gorse, yellow in every direction. Walking through not long after, she spotted a small black and white bird she'd never seen on her own family's land. A tomtit. Over the years that followed, she kept noticing them. They spread outward from the center of Hinewai, a little further every season. The gorse spread too, in plain view of everyone watching. What most of them didn't know was that Wilson was still bound by the same law they wanted him to follow. Local rules required him to clear a strip of gorse along the property boundary, and inspectors checked it every year. He kept that strip clear. He touched nothing else. One of his loudest critics ended up owing him a favor. In 1988, the worst drought New Zealand had seen in years hit Banks Peninsula. Grass was dying on the neighboring farms, and cattle started to starve. Wilson opened Hinewai's gate. He let that same critic bring his starving cattle onto the parts of Hinewai that still had grass. Thinning it out also helped the native seedlings underneath. The man who'd once dismissed him changed his mind for good. For years, he was the only one who had. The trust wasn't waiting for more proof. In 1991, the trust bought Otanerito Station next door, adding 870 hectares to Hinewai. The reserve grew to nearly 10 times its original size, years before there was anything to point to but gorse. The resolution. By 1994, Wilson didn't need to imagine where this was headed. The land was already showing him. Pockets of old growth that had survived untouched. Young native forest already closing overhead where gorse had stood a decade earlier. And still, more than half the land, a wall of yellow gorse doing exactly what he'd predicted it would. He put a number on where it was heading. Give it 50 years, and 95% of Hinewai would be native forest again. Skepticism came in more than one form. Some doubted the land would ever fully recover. Others just didn't believe Wilson's numbers. Wilson kept managing the reserve through all of it. Photo points he'd first set up in 1988 got revisited more than 2 decades later from the exact same ground. Gorse used to fill every one of those frames, edge to edge. Now the frames show a different kind of vegetation entirely. A fern understory covers the ground. Trees rise well overhead. There's no yellow left in any of it. Wilson's own hands touched almost none of it. Fences held the grazing animals back. Traps kept the possums from eating the seedlings before they had a chance. Past the fence line, he didn't do anything else at all. 39 years passed. By 2026, this is what Hinewai had become. 1,700 hectares of it is forest now. Canopy so thick in places the sky disappears. 35 native bird species live there now. New Zealand falcons found their own way back. Waterfalls that used to run dry by January now hold water through the whole summer, year after year. The trust doesn't have to cover it all alone anymore. Carbon credits and donations bring in enough now to keep the reserve growing on its own. The law never changed. Banks Peninsula still classifies gorse as a plant landowners are required to destroy. And every year an inspector checks that Wilson has cleared the strip along Hinewai's boundary. He complies. On paper, he always has. But the law rested on one assumption. It assumed gorse only destroys land. Wilson never broke it. He just proved that assumption wrong. On every acre of Hinewai, the law never made him touch. The girl who saw nothing but gorse is in her 40s now. Her name is Marie Haley. She still tells that story to visitors, walking the same hillside. What she shows them now is different. Tree ferns fill the space beneath the canopy. Waterfalls that used to run dry every summer flow year-round. Tomtits move freely through the valley now. They're the same birds she first spotted decades ago, long since spread past where she found them. Hugh Wilson still lives on the reserve in the same cabin. Twice a year he handwrites a newsletter called Pipipi and mails it to 2,000 people who want to know what's growing. It's the Maori name for a small brown bird that's loud enough to hear outside his window most mornings. He has never planted a single tree there. If a story like this changed how you think about what land can do when it's left alone, let us know in the comments. Share it with someone who'd like it too. We've got more stories like this one coming. Subscribe so you don't miss them.